Good evening, everybody. Just give us a few more minutes to make sure all of the participants have arrived and that everybody is in the chat. We've had a very large number of people sign up and register for this webinar, and we're just very slowly letting them in. We're ticking up over the 300 mark, which is a signal of the importance of this meeting, I think. So let's begin. So welcome everybody to this evening's very, very important webinar. No war on Iran, stop arming Israel, no to nuclear hypocrisy. My name is Tom Monterena, and I'm very proud to be the chair of the campaign for nuclear disarmament. And I welcome you all here this evening. We all know why we're here. And in fact, this could be one of the most important meetings that we've had for a very long time, because we're faced once again with a situation where it could be the case that the British government is preparing itself by fair means or foul to go to war in the Middle East once more. Israel has launched a war of aggression against Iran. President Trump is threatening to join the fray. The stakes are very, very high. Nuclear facilities across Iran have been targeted at the same time that Israel continues its genocide against the people of Palestine. The Middle East is literally a powder keg, and the question for us tonight is, what can we do in the United Kingdom to call out the facts around what has happened around Iran and what is continuing to happen with Israel's onslaught against the Palestinians, and what can we do to prevent the possibility, and it is a possibility, the possibility that the British government might choose to follow the US into intervention in Iran and a war in the Middle East once again. So we have a number of very important speakers with a long track record of involvement with the peace and anti-war movement who will share their expertise with us. And our first speaker this evening is Mariam Eslam Doust, who's the General Secretary of the Transport and Salaried Staff Association, a transport union, and she's our first speaker this evening. Over to you, Mariam.
Thank you, Tom. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for being here today to discuss Israel's attack on Iran. My name is Mariam Eslam Doust. I am the General Secretary of TSSA, but today I am here I'm not here in my official capacity. I'm speaking as a British Iranian woman, and more personally, as a daughter. I haven't heard from my father, who's in Iran for over 48 hours. The last time we spoke, he told me the roads out of Tehran were gridlocked. Millions of people were trying to flee the city. Petrol was gone. He couldn't fill his car to leave the city. Millions were trying to escape Tehran. It was near midnight, and I haven't been able to get hold of him since. That's because Iran's telecommunications the telecommunications infrastructure has been attacked by Israel. People can't make phone calls, they can't connect to the internet, they're being cut off from the world, all while missiles continue to fall, cars are being blown up in daylight, and civilian neighborhoods are attacked. And I'm hearing now that the Iranian banking system has been hacked. So overnight, people's savings have disappeared. This is not just a military strategy by Israel and Donald Trump. It's a strategy of collapse to paralyze Iran, its infrastructure, its morale, and its people. And it's not just physical; it's psychological. Yesterday, Iran state TV was hacked live on air. Viewers across the country saw their screens cut to unfamiliar visuals and messages delivered in Farsi, encouraging Iranians to rise up, to revolt, misusing women life freedom slogans. And a day before that, the state TV news building in Tehran, the same network was bombed. While a woman presenter was live on air. So this is not just an airstrike, it's a message that we can get inside your buildings, your screens, your minds. It's an attempt to intimidate and destabilize, not just with force, but with fear. Israel's illegal attack on Iran is not about self-defense or security. This is about making Iran collapse as a state, politically, economically, and socially. We have seen this before in Iraq, Libya, Syria. It's the same script: isolate, destabilize, dehumanize, destroy. And what's more alarming today in today's media is that it unfolds without any challenge. 20 years ago, some journalists and some editors still had the courage to question war narratives. Today, far too many are simply repeating the government's briefings and anonymous intelligence sources. This is no critical interrogation of the story. The press, sadly, is not holding power to account, it is echoing it. And then there's the propaganda war, the information war. In recent days, I've seen social media flooded with posts in Farsi from IDF accounts using the Iranian language and the language of the Iranian protest movements from 2 years ago, so especially the slogan "Woman, Life, Freedom," to call for regime change. But those slogans are never meant to justify bombs. They were meant to justify the suffering of civilians, Iranian women, and those who shouted them wanted dignity and justice, not war. So, amid all this, what I've seen from Iranians, both inside the country and the diaspora, is remarkable unity. This isn't political unity. There are still very real debates about Iran's future, its leadership, its systems. But right now, across the political spectrum amongst Iranians, people are united on one fundamental idea: that foreign bombs won't liberate us. Iranians don't want their futures dictated by missiles, invasions, or destabilization campaigns disguised as solidarity. So let me speak about the issue that's constantly weaponized by the Western media, Iran's nuclear program. We're being told once again that Iran is on the verge of developing a nuclear program, but the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, has been clear there are no credible indications that Iran has a nuclear weapons program. That was their official assessment before these escalations even began. So what has Iran done? It's reduced voluntary cooperation with the IAEA. That was originally agreed as part of the JCPOA, the nuclear deal that Donald Trump tore up in 2018. So for years after that, Iran continued to comply with the deal's core provisions, but eventually it said, if the deal's dead, then why should we keep making concessions? Even so, Iran remains signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the IAEA still monitors its nuclear sites. There is no legal evidence of weaponization. Meanwhile, there is one country in the Middle East with a confirmed nuclear arsenal, and that's Israel. It has hundreds of warheads. It has never joined the NPT. It allows no international inspection, and yet it is presented in the West as a responsible actor. That is double standards of the highest order. So the demands being made of Iran right now are to surrender, for compliance, for regime change. These are just unrealistic. They are dangerous. There is no military solution to this crisis. Iran will not and cannot surrender to conditions it knows will only bring more pain. So what's the path forward? Diplomacy, but real diplomacy. Iran has repeatedly said it's willing to accept limits on its uranium enrichment, allow extensive international monitoring, engage in regional security talks, but that has to be mutual. And that means it has to end the sanctions that are strangling the economy and civilians, and restoring Iran's full participation in global political and economic life, and ending the policy of permanent isolation. And if the West is serious about peace in the region, it must also hold all states accountable, including its allies. And that means finally addressing Israel's illegal wars, its undeclared nuclear weapons, and its current actions in Gaza, which the UN's own experts have said may amount to genocide. So what do we do now? Keep speaking up. We're not just being neutral. If we stay silent, we are being complicit. And I'm asking you, whether you are trade unionists, policymakers, academics, journalists, or just someone who believes in justice, do three things. Speak up. Say clearly that bombing Iran into collapse is not a path to peace. Demand diplomacy. Press your government to stop fueling war and start pursuing a deal. And challenge the narrative. Don't let slogans be co-opted. Don't let another war be justified on false pretenses. The Iranian people want peace, they want dignity, and they want the right to shape their own future, free from bombs, free from fear, and free from foreign coercion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariam. Free from bombs, free from fear, and free from foreign coercion. Absolutely. And so thank you, Mariam, for that very important introduction to our discussion this evening. Like everybody else here, all 408 of you online so far, I can't begin to imagine how it feels to have a loved one, a relative who you're waiting for information from, who's in a zone which is being actively bombed as we speak. So to those of you who are late joining us, welcome to this very important webinar, No War in Iran, Stop Arming Israel, No to Nuclear Hypocrisy, organised by the Stop the War Coalition and the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. My name's Tom Monterena. I'm very proud to be the chair of CND. We are encouraging people to put questions into the Q&A function, and hopefully we will have time to address as many of those as possible. Our next speaker this evening needs very little introduction from me. It's Jeremy Corbyn, the independent MP for Islington North, and a very, very long-standing opponent of Britain's participation in war and of wars generally. He's also one of our vice presidents of CND. So over to you, Jeremy, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom, and thank you for organising this event, to CND, Stop the War, and all others are involved. And thanks to the almost 500 people that are on the call. And whilst Zoom meetings are not my favourite pastime by any manner of means, it does mean we can get 500 people together very quickly without any great cost. And organising a rally of 500 people is a much bigger undertaking. So thank you all for being here. I've obviously been in Parliament for the past few weeks, listening to a lot of things that are going on, and there's something deeply depressing about it. The Prime Minister produced the Strategic Defence Review report, which is not very long, not very detailed, not very substantial, very glossy, only 4 pictures of himself, and lots of pictures of ships and missiles and so on. And it reiterates everything that Boris Johnson said and did, which was about repeating or reinventing Britain's global role. Goes on to say that the nuclear deterrent is a central part of that strategy, and goes on to say that we've got to be ready for every eventuality. The Prime Minister followed this up by saying we had to be ready for war, And the Chancellor of the Exchequer, having 1 week told us there was a 22 billion black hole, the next week told us that we had to be very careful how we spent money. Hence, £5 billion was taken from the Department of Work and Pensions budget by cutting the personal independence payments of people with disabilities and needs to get that personal independence support. And then miraculously found money for a huge increase in current defence expenditure and a long-term strategy of rising to immediately 2.5%, then 3%, then 3.5%, and now there are proposals to go up to 5%, which no doubt will come out at the NATO summit next week. So there you have it. Defence expenditure, roughly speaking, 80 billion a year, to rise by at least 13 billion a year in short order. A new generation of nuclear-powered submarines, a new generation of nuclear missiles. The word peace barely appeared in the defence review, and all the discussion is only ever about getting ready for war. And we live in a dangerous and very, very perilous time. The war in Ukraine grinds on, unwinnable by either side. Hundreds of thousands of dead on both sides of conscripted soldiers. It has a sort of First World War unreality about it, that both sides will just continue fighting this war. There has to be serious proposals for a ceasefire. And I have floated the idea with a number of colleagues, including when I was at a left parliamentary meeting in Brussels last week, where we had a discussion about the militarization of Europe. I said it's time for the peace movement and left forces around the world to take an initiative and try and encourage and bring about some kind of talks that will lead to a ceasefire, then deal with the underlying issues between Russia and Ukraine at a later date. But anything's got to be better than the continued killing. We now have the even greater danger of a wider conflict. There's a danger with Ukraine and Russia because both have access in one form or the other to nuclear weapons. We now have the very dangerous situation in Iran, with the bombardment of Iran, the discussion of President Trump using bunker busting bombs to destroy the nuclear research and facilities in Iran. And from that, obviously, spins out of control the danger either of a nuclear fallout just from the explosions that would take place, or something even worse than that. And as Marianne was pointing out, the other party in this, Israel, already arraigned before the international judicial process for genocide, acts of genocide in Gaza, for the starvation of children, which is a war crime, for the occupation of the West Bank, for the settlement policy, and for now a deliberate policy of starvation of the people of Gaza, has suddenly been turned into an ally of the West because it's deemed to be under attack from Iran, even though it launched a preemptive strike against Iran and was quite open that it was a preemptive strike. And the British troops have been rushed to the region. The RAF base at Akrotiri, already used for overflying to Gaza, to send back surveillance information, which presumably ends up with Israel by some means or the other. And we are moving to an incredibly dangerous situation. So what do we do as a peace movement? Because as a peace movement, we're actually very big. We've got well over 1 million people have taken part in some kind of activity in support of the people of Palestine over the past 18 months. That's those that have been on demonstrations, national or local, written emails, signed petitions, been to meetings, undertaken public activities and so on. So you have a huge basically a huge block of people that are prepared to do something. The same applies all over Europe and indeed all over North America. So we do have a voice there, which we need to be using much more. But the danger is now that the US decides it's going to join in with Israel in the bombing of Iran. And Trump has already said that his mind isn't made up, but it'll be made up 1 second before he makes the decision, whatever that means, or whatever that decision is. And he is claiming, as is the administration, that Iran already has access to nuclear weapons. They don't. Why am I so confident in saying that? Mainly because Iran says it doesn't have any, the IEA says it doesn't have any, and the CIA says it doesn't have any. So I think when you've got that group of people all saying the same thing, it's probably pretty likely to be the case. And so there will be a war against Iran, very like the war against Iraq, on the basis that Iraq held weapons of mass destruction, which simply did not exist. They were a figment of somebody's imagination, and we were driven into a war which cost billions of pounds and dollars and thousands, if not millions, of lives one way or the other as a result of it, and unleashed all the instability that's followed. So how do we make our voices heard? We can recognize there are differences in the political support base of Trump between what Tucker Carlson says, what Elon Musk says, and what various other right-wing forces in the USA say. They're clearly not agreed. Some of them are on a sort of American isolationist strategy. Others are saying we've got to bomb Iran because they believe it is a threat to Israel. And so we can't rely on that division in order to bring about a ceasefire and bring about an end to this conflict. So we have to mobilize much more on a global basis. Now, a number of things have happened. I'm part of Progressive International, which set up the Hague Group of countries, which has agreed that they will work together on the Hague Declaration, the one that we did in the Hague, which is in support of the decisions made at the ICC and the ICJ on the basis of the illegality of Israel's activity and the illegality of arms trade and arms supplies to Israel. And that group is getting stronger and more active and more effective, and that is an important, if at the moment fairly small, but an important block in the UN which we can work with and develop. And I'm very much part of that. I'm in the cabinet group of Progressive International. The other thing that we've done in Britain is the start of an inquiry process as per Chilcot, but hopefully with more teeth, into an examination of British foreign policy, arms sales and trade with Israel during this last 18-month period, but obviously over a longer period as well. And I got a bill through its first stage in Parliament. I'm quite convinced it's going to be blocked for the next stage, but we're working on ways of continuing through Peace and Justice Project of leading on a bigger inquiry into all of this, which helps to give us the intellectual and political space and hopefully some media coverage which begins to question the role of the arms trade and the arms industry in the manufacture of British foreign policy. Many on this call, I can see Lindsay, I can see Paul and others, contributed to our book, The Monstrous Anger of the Guns, based on the Wilfred Owen poem Anthem for a Doomed Youth. And we've been doing events all over the country to promote the book and discuss the contents of it. And they have helped to bring a lot of people into serious discussion about peace, arms conversion strategy, anti-nuclear strategy, non-nuclear defense strategy, and so on. So it is up to us all to be mobilized. And I'll finish on this. I'll be there on Saturday at the big march. There will also be a big event going on in The Hague tomorrow evening, and in particular on Saturday, saying much the same as us. There will be demonstrations outside the NATO Council of Ministers meeting the following week. And there is a European Foreign Secretaries meeting this weekend as well, which I hope there'll be the appropriate noises made towards them. We have to mobilize people very, very rapidly. This is an incredibly perilous and dangerous moment. 60,000 already dead in Gaza, children being starved to death and killed before our very eyes, and the demonstration of the power of weaponry by Israel and to a lesser extent by Iran goes on before our very eyes as exchange of missiles takes place. This unless stopped, can only go one way. That is worse, into a hot war. That will drag in other forces. It will certainly drag the US into it, and I suspect Keir Starmer and others are contemplating Britain being dragged into this war as well. We've been here before. We've seen what happens when you destroy a society, as in Afghanistan, as in Iraq, as in Libya. The consequences go on for a very long time. I was in Iran in 2014 on a parliamentary delegation. It was a very strange experience because I was on a delegation that included Jack Straw and Lord Lamont and Ben Wallace. I was the peace person on the delegation. And we had a lot of discussions. I raised human rights issues all the time. Whilst I support Iran, it doesn't mean I'm not very well aware of the human rights position and the attacks on working class communities and working class organisations in Iran. But that's not a reason to go to war against Iran. I then raised the whole issue, as we all did, about the potential of a nuclear deal, which eventually happened. And Iran was quite clear. They said, if we can get a deal and the lifting of sanctions, we will engage on all the other issues that you have raised with us. What we cannot do is accept the idea that we will be strangled by sanctions, that will be threatened by nuclear war, and will be told we're not allowed to develop even nuclear power stations. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think anybody should have nuclear weapons. I've been a member of CND all my life and intend to remain a member of CND. But let's do everything we can to stop the wars in Ukraine, in Gaza, in the West Bank, and the even greater danger now, which is what is happening in Iran. Together, we're very strong. Together, we can be very loud. Let's make sure we stay together, become even stronger and even louder. Thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you, Jeremy. And just to reiterate the point, the key point in all of that Jeremy said, that it is time again for the peace movement to take the initiative and to raise again the point that Jeremy made about the parallels between what is happening now and the drumbeats of war, the lies, the manipulation, and everything else that we saw more than 20 years ago. Now, more than 20 years ago, I was young and ignorant. I'm not so young anymore, but it was very, very clear that the drive to war and the drumbeats of war were very, very dangerous indeed. If you're not already a member of CND or Stop the War, if you're not already involved in a peace organisation, get involved, get active, get engaged, because we need to rebuild the scale of the peace and anti-war movement that we saw those 2 decades ago now, because the situation is that serious. Our next speaker this evening is Sophie Bolt, who's the General Secretary of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. Over to you, Sophie.
Thanks very much, Tom. And, it's an absolute pleasure to be following Mariam. Such a powerful, contribution. Just really sort of humanises how, horrific the situation already is for people in Iran, or, who have loved ones in Iran. But also to follow Jeremy, with his sort of lifetime of like tireless campaigning for nuclear disarmament. And I just feel that this situation just exposes how important that is. I mean, as people have said, it's not even a week since Israel, launched its illegal war on Iran, and now already the US is, talking openly about joining it, and the Starmer's cabinet are doing the same. I mean, this is a really, really horrific but very rapid escalation that really risks dragging us all into a very, very dangerous war that could go nuclear. Trump's really shocking threats to assassinate Iran's supreme leader and calling for Iran's unconditional surrender, I think shows that Israel's sort of illegal war in Iran really isn't really about sort of Iran's nuclear program, but it's actually about the US and Israel having plans for regime change in Iran. and it's about intensifying the genocidal war against the Palestinians and basically sort of subordinating the entire region. You know, as people have said already, like hundreds of people have been killed in both Iran and Israel. The International Atomic Energy Agency has condemned Israel's bombing of Iran's nuclear facilities and reported that the military attacks on Natanz nuclear plant have caused localized radioactivity leaks. I mean, how horrifying is that? At the moment, it appears that they are internal to the facility, but we don't know how long that's the case. And the Director General, Rafael Grossi, has said that military escalation increases the chance of a radiological release with serious consequences for people and the environment. And despite this, it's being widely circulated in the media that Israel wants the US to use £30,000 bunker buster bombs to destroy the underground Fordo nuclear facility. You know, such an attack could also release, you know, radiation into the atmosphere on, you know, on a very large scale. You know, Israel argues, and it's backed by the US and the full G7, that it has a right to defend itself, that Iran's nuclear program represents a direct threat to it. Yet, you know, as we've heard, the assessment of the IAEA and US intelligence is that Iran is not developing nuclear weapons. And in fact, Israel's actions is far more likely to push Iran towards developing them. You know, in response to the escalation, we've seen the Iran's parliament is preparing legislation to withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. You know, and the NPT sets out a framework whereby nuclear weapons states agree to take steps to disarm their nuclear weapons, whilst non-nuclear weapon states can develop civilian nuclear power, but must not, you know, develop nuclear weapons. Now, Iran's president has insisted Iran does not intend to develop nuclear weapons, and reports indicate that Iran is, you know, very keen to reconvene talks with the US, provided there is a ceasefire. But, you know, this is a very concerning development. You know, Iran withdrawing from the NPT, and it's clearly a direct consequence of Israel's military attacks. And US threats to join Israel's war on Iran, you know, assassinate its leader, are more likely to precipitate Iran's withdrawal from the treaty. Today's editorial in The Guardian puts it this way: Israel does not appear to be striking Iran because US nuclear diplomacy has failed, but because it fears it might succeed. Now, I think this is giving too much credit to Trump. Because the reality is that both Trump and Netanyahu have repeatedly sabotaged diplomatic efforts to ensure Iran doesn't develop weapons-grade enriched uranium. In 2018, Donald Trump trashed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, as Marianne was referring to. You know, this was set up precisely to facilitate a peaceful process of ensuring Iran complied with very strict controls of its nuclear facilities in exchange for the US lifting crippling sanctions on the Iranian people. You know, basically sort of collective punishment on the Iranian people. And whilst Iran met all of the JCPOA terms, restricting its uranium enrichment, reducing its stockpiles, and cooperating with wide-ranging inspections, Trump reneged on the deal, refused to lift the sanctions, and instead he intensified them. And what about Israel? When talks resumed under President Biden in 2021, I think it was, there is strong evidence that Israel carried out a cyber attack on the Natanz nuclear facility to sabotage these talks. And of course, this is all about, you know, total nuclear hypocrisy, isn't it? Israel has over 90 nuclear weapons, totally refuses any IAEA inspections, and its heritage minister threatened to use them against Gaza to try and precipitate, to accelerate the genocide to the Palestinian people. Yet there's no public statements from the G7 for Israel to disarm. Instead, you know, the US is a key military and financial backer, and Britain historically assisted Israel's nuclear program, and today grants export licenses for its submarines, which are believed to house nuclear weapons. But this also exposes the wider nuclear hypocrisy of all the nuclear weapon states that have signed up to the NPT and beyond. So instead of taking steps to disarm its nuclear weapons, Britain is replacing and modernizing its nuclear submarines, and it's trying to buy F-35A fighter jets so that it can launch US nuclear bombs too. And it even justifies the use of nuclear weapons to secure nuclear non-proliferation. That's what it's saying, that it feels that it has a right to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states in order to secure non-proliferation. So it refers to any non-nuclear weapon state that has signed up to the NPT and is in breach of their non-proliferation obligations. Britain has a right to use its nuclear weapons against them. How is Iran, in this current situation, supposed to interpret such nuclear threats? And of course, such threats will do nothing to counter proliferation and everything to drive it. So on all levels, this threat to widen the war on Iran is an absolute disaster. As people have said, we can all remember the horror. We're still living with the horror of the Iraq War, a country half the size of Iran, in which over 500,000 people were killed and millions more were displaced. Such a war on Iran would be absolutely catastrophic. It would draw in other nuclear weapon states, increasing the threat of global nuclear war in a context where we know the threat of nuclear weapons being used is much higher. There's a great deal of discussion about normalizing the use of nuclear weapons. So it's absolutely critical that we maximize the pressure on the British government to step back from the brink. It needs to disengage with Israel. It needs to disengage with the US. We need maximum pressure on nuclear-armed genocidal Israel. We have to secure an immediate ceasefire and return to talks to resolve the crisis through diplomacy. And that means putting more pressure onto Israel. So that means we need more sanctions and we need a full arms embargo now. But also it means we really have to strengthen the movement for global nuclear disarmament, which is behind all of this, is driving this increasing threat of the use of nuclear weapons, where might is right and the world is organized, through those who have most power in the world, which has basically sort of, dragged us to this terrible situation that we face now. We need a new world order that's based on global cooperation and peace. And that is what we are all here to try and secure. So thanks very much. And yes, look forward to seeing everybody on Saturday. Thanks.
Thank you, Sophie, and thank you for emphasising once again the reality of the situation is that there is one nuclear armed state in the Middle East, and that is Israel. It also happens to be a nuclear armed state which is carrying out a genocide and which has launched a war of aggression against Iran. Now, I don't know about you, but I regularly tune into BBC News broadcasts, and I don't think once I've heard the reality of the situation communicated in that way. Not once have I heard BBC News presenters or BBC commentators introducing the topic of Israel without linking it directly to the fact that Israel is a nuclear armed state. And so facts matter, the reality matters. And one person who has done a huge amount over decades now to furnish the peace and anti-war movements with facts and with a dose of reality, along with some very incisive analysis, is Paul Rogers, who's an emeritus professor of peace studies at the University of Bradford and author of a huge number of important essays and books, one of which is staring down at me from my shelves over there, Losing Control, which is an essential read for those of us in the peace and anti-war movement. So I'll hand over to Paul Rogers now. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thanks for those very generous comments. I just want to spend a few minutes answering some very straightforward questions which are coming up all the time. How did we get to where we are? What does the Israeli government want? Not the Israeli people as a whole, but the Israeli government. What does the United States want? What is Britain's role? And can we really change things? On the first of how do we get here? Well, obviously, the situation in Gaza started at the time of Israeli independence with the Nakba, with probably 200,000 people, nearly a third of the total, ending up in Gaza. It was under the control of the Egyptians till 67, and then the Israelis after that. But from about 20 years ago, after elections actually elected a Hamas government, which wasn't accepted by anybody, basically the Israelis took over and have controlled it more and more closely over the last 20 years. What has happened in the more recent past is a series of wars in Gaza, which we tend to forget about, 4 in all, before the current one. And that has led to about 5,000 Palestinians being killed, and many, many examples of ruined districts in Gaza City and elsewhere. What happened very recently in 2023 was that the Israelis really were lured into thinking that they had things completely under control. And instead, you had the 7th of October, when the Israelis were hit and hit extremely badly. That really has galvanized a very anti-Arab mood within Israel. It's perhaps natural, but it's happened. And essentially, it has given the Netanyahu government more or less free rein to do what it wants. What does the Netanyahu government actually want? Well, as far as we can tell, and let me stress, this is not all Israelis. What it would like, and particularly the strong religious and other nationalist elements within it, but basically like Gaza as cleared of all Palestinians as possible. If possible, all 2.3 million of them evicted in some way to other countries outside of Israel. That's what it would like. What else would it like? Well, certainly it wants to show that it is easily the strongest military power in the region. Remember that Israel hasn't just been involved in Gaza and now in Iran. It has also been bombing in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, and in the less recent past, even in Iraq. So Israel is very much in the business of trying to show that it is the regional superpower. In terms of Iran, well, obviously it wants rid of any sort of nuclear problem. It must feel that it is the only nuclear country in the region, but also it's becoming more and more clear that it wants actually to have regime change in Iran, either regime change or regime collapse, and they are different. That would be absolutely disastrous in many ways. At the same time, what is it the United States wants? Again, the United States government, and particularly Trump. Well, who can be sure about that? It is very strong in support for Israel for many different reasons. More and more Americans are getting very concerned about that. But essentially, Trump, I think, wants to take part in this war if he can, if he knows he can be sure that he personally will come out of it very well. And I think the odds are now moving towards direct American intervention. Remember, the United States already is a big player in the Israel war against Iran and other areas. It's a huge American radar system within Israel, actually run by over 100 American military personnel, which gives advance warning. And there are many other ways in which the United States is involved. And one of the worries is that the Iranians seem to be getting more of their missiles through into Israel than the Israelis or the Americans expected. And there have been a number of major bomb attacks, missile attacks in cities. That paradoxically is having the impact of actually making the Israeli government more secure, because the Israelis obviously are very concerned that this is happening even in their cities. Can we do anything about this? Are we in a position to do so? I think Britain is actually in a very important position. It is second only to the United States in the support that it has been offering Israel. And if you look at Declassified UK or Air Wars, for example, as two very good websites, they are full of information on this. And essentially, I think we have to be much more loud in our demands that Britain gets out of this, that it stops all weapons sales, that it stops supporting Israel in a multitude of ways, and recognizes the state of Palestine. That at least would be a start, and we should be really going for that in a major way. Beyond that, there's much more we can try and do, but it seems to me that what we have to recognize is it is possible to have an impact. Let me take you back to February 2006, I think it was, when 2003, when there was all the concern about war in Iraq, and a massive demonstration in London took place. I think it was one of the biggest ever in British political history to stop that war. They failed. People failed to do that and were very bitterly disappointed. But there's pretty good evidence that 3 years after that, when the Americans under George W. Bush were looking at the possibility of going into war with Iran, In fact, they were desisted from this, both by the impact of the public information that was coming out, the impact of the public mood, and in Britain's case, the size of those demonstrations. I think ordinary people can make a much more effective counter than they realize, and we've got to use our power to every possibility. Two other things, don't forget the very good websites, the CND one on the new security policy, the Alternative Defence Review, and also always remember rethinkingsecurity.org, which is saying very different things from very different perspectives and well worth reading. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Paul. Excellent contribution. And I think the point that Paul makes about scrutinising and exposing and working against Britain's ongoing support for Israel, even outside of the current situation we have now and their ongoing genocide, is an important one. There are two public documents, a Memorandum of Understanding and a Roadmap 2030, which hint at some of the level of military cooperation between the United Kingdom and Israel. There's also an agreement which has never been published, which has never been scrutinised in Parliament. What does it say? What does it commit the United Kingdom to do? We get some hints of that around the fact that even in a period where Israel is conducting a genocide against the Palestinian people, IDF members, IDF Israeli soldiers are actively being trained in the United Kingdom. And that is just the tip of the iceberg. Paul mentioned the 2003 demonstration against the war in Iraq, and our next speaker was central to ensuring that that demonstration took place and was central to building the mass anti-war movement we saw against the war in Iraq. So it's my pleasure to hand over now to Lindsay German, the convener of the Stop the War Coalition. Thank you, Lindsay.
Thanks very much, Tom, and it's a great pleasure to be here and to hear all the previous speakers. What I want to add, really, I suppose, is partly the point that Paul made about the importance of demonstrating, and I don't think we should ever underestimate the importance of demonstrating. They always try to say, doesn't make a difference, it's not important, and sometimes people feel that themselves, but we should be aware the governments and the politicians and the military keep a very, very close eye on what we're doing. And it's one reason we have to step up our campaigning now, as we have done over Gaza, but also over this attack on Iran as well. And I find it an absolutely astonishing way in which it is now being presented. It's almost sort of, when you listen to reports on the radio and television, it's almost in a completely blasé way that, well, we may be bombing a nuclear installation. There's even talk not just of the bunker buster bomb, which some experts think won't even succeed in destroying that installation, but they're talking about Trump might even have to use a nuclear bomb, which of course might be a bit embarrassing even for Trump to have to use a nuclear weapon in order to stop Iran allegedly getting any of their own nuclear weapons. So perhaps they won't be able to do that. But, the talk of unconditional surrender, which we should remember the way that the Japanese were treated in 1945 when they demanded unconditional surrender to atomic bombs were dropped on Japanese cities. When you talk about regime change and the fact that the head of Iran doesn't deserve to live because one hospital in Israel has been hit, whereas, as we all know, every hospital in Gaza has been hit repeatedly over the last 20 months. And to me, the most disturbing thing is this idea that Israel has the right to defend itself. And this was the statement that the European powers and the G7 have both put themselves firmly in the Israeli camp and said that this is self-defense by Israel. Now, there is no way, Sophie and other people have talked about what actually is happening with the development or otherwise of a bomb in Iran, but there is absolutely no way that you can justify a strike on or a series of strikes on the country, including assassinations of key nuclear scientists and assassinations of political figures and generals and so on. There is no way you can justify a strike on a country nearly 1,000 miles away as in some way self-defense, and especially not when we've seen what Netanyahu has been doing to the Palestinian people for the last 20 months. And I think one of the things we need to be aware of, Netanyahu would not now be doing this, and Trump would not now be contemplating whether to drop these bombs if it were not for the fact that the impunity with which Netanyahu has been able to act over the last period in Gaza, the fact he's been able to preside over mass bombing of people, the killing of tens of thousands of people, the ethnic cleansing of people, the war crimes, on and on and on, and now the starvation of people in Gaza. All of this has been presided over by a completely malleable group of politicians across Europe and across the Western world. Now, we now have Trump doing this statement. He hasn't made up his mind, but he's kind of thinking about it. And we're supposed to have to spend the next few days sitting on in fear, waiting for this to happen. Now, if you remember when Trump was inaugurated earlier this year, he said that he wanted to be the person who ended war rather than started wars. And actually, it's quite interesting that already there is widespread opposition among his own supporters to what he is doing or what he's planning to do over Iraq. Even people like Steve Bannon are very, very reluctant because they understand in a way that maybe Trump doesn't fully understand, that actually not only if there is this attack on Iran and the attempt at regime change, which by the way I suspect won't succeed at least initially, that not only will we have a forever war, the wars that the Americans didn't want to have to continue, but it will be on a worse scale than the forever wars that they've had to deal with in Afghanistan, in Iraq, Libya, Syria, and all the others that we've been talking about. And you have a situation where the foreign secretary of this country, David Lammy, very, very close to Keir Starmer, said about Trump only a few years ago that he's a neo-Nazi sympathizing sociopath. Now, Lammy's tried to dismiss this since Trump has again become president by saying, oh, that's just old news. Well, if that's old news, what is the new news? Is the new news that we are allowing this neo-Nazi sympathizing sociopath to actually start another major war? And when we talk about a major war, we're not just talking about the Middle East, we're talking about how this will link up with the conflict in Ukraine, how it will link up with what's going on in China and the militarization of the Pacific, which is going on all the time. And in a way, you have to ask yourself, what can possibly go wrong? Now, of course, everybody talks about this. Oh, there'll just be one strike and that will be okay. That will get rid of the attempt to develop nuclear power. But actually, most experts are saying that they think it wouldn't solve that problem, even if we thought that was the right way to go with it. But the Iranians will still continue to try to develop a nuclear bomb, and in a way that wouldn't be so surprising. And in that situation, what else can happen? Well, I would suggest if they severely wound the Iranian government, or indeed manage to replace it, you'll see a much bigger increase in terrorism. You'll see dirty bombs. You'll see all sorts of things which are much more like asymmetrical warfare than the kind of conventional warfare between states. And I can't really believe, after all this time, people have referred to the Iraq war and everything else, I can't really believe we're here again. People who say we're going to go to war because we want to give women some democracy and rights. We're standing up for women's rights. Well, none of these wars have done anything to help women's rights, and exactly the opposite. They talk about regime change, just as they talked about it with Saddam Hussein, with Gaddafi, with all these different people. None of them have succeeded in the slightest, and every country in which they've intervened has been worse off as a result of it. And of course, they're coming out with, as they came out with weapons of mass destruction, now they're saying, yes, we know there's a nuclear weapon that we have, or there's going to be one developed. Whereas, as has already been said, Israel is the only country in the Middle East that has nuclear weapons and will not allow any inspections or anything else to go on. So these are all, I think, huge questions for us, and we have to oppose this war with every single fibre of our bodies, because we're in the most dangerous time that we've been, I think, for decades in this country. And although I think the British government and Starmer are obviously frightened of what Trump is doing and don't really want to get involved, the truth is Britain is complicit in all these things, and Britain has bases in the Middle East, has the naval base in Bahrain, it has military personnel in Oman and in Saudi Arabia, and all of these things can very, very quickly escalate into a big war. So I think, just to reiterate what people are saying, that we need to stop arming Israel, which is the rogue state of the Middle East, which is acting in this manner all the time and is doing so completely off the leash, that nobody is able or is even trying to restrain Netanyahu. We have to keep on the streets and keep organising. We have to go much, much deeper into the trade unions. As I understand it, I don't know what the result has been, but the Unison conference today, certainly they were discussing a statement opposing any intervention in Iran, which I think is very, very important. I think we need to do all these things. But mostly we've got to say to people, I think Marianne made this point right at the beginning, we've got to get this argument across. This is not about trying to stop nuclear war. Actually, it's a recipe towards making nuclear war a much, much closer reality, because it will lead to the greatest instability and the greatest threat of war anywhere. So please be on the demonstration if you can on Saturday, but please pass resolution through your union branch, hold meetings to stop the war on CND, join Stop the War on CND, do all these things. We've got to create a really mass movement. We have a mass movement around Palestine, and that's incredibly important for us, but we've also got to build it around Iran and around all the other attacks that are going to take place over the next few years. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. And I want to reiterate the point that she made, and that's that we need to oppose this war and this war drive with every single fibre of our bodies. Now, Lindsay mentioned some of the developments in the trade unions, and it's a fact that the role of trade unions in the peace and anti-war movement is of incredible importance. If we just consider some of the things that Jeremy mentioned earlier around the strategic defence review and alternative ideas about production, CND was part of something called the Alternative Defence Review, which is available on our website, which is a counter position to the one being put by our government. And we're working towards getting this discussed and spread around the trade union movement itself. And we have another speaker from the unions here this evening, Sean Vernell, who's an activist and a member, and I think, if I'm correct, an executive member of the University and Colleges Union. Sean's also a very long-standing activist and has been involved in peace activism for a very, very long time. And in terms of what the trade unions can do, CND and the Stop the War Coalition and others have been promoting the slogan of welfare, not warfare, because every single penny that is spent on the drive to war, preparing for the sorts of things we're seeing in the Middle East right now, not to mention the plans contained in Starmer's Strategic Defence Review, are paid for by working people, are paid for by the most vulnerable people in our society. And whilst children live in poverty in this country, our government is committing to spending extra tens of billions of pounds on machines of death, destruction, and genocide. So I'm going to hand over to Sean Vernell now from UCU. Thanks, Sean.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks everybody else for the excellent contributions. And I want to reinforce the urgency about the situation and the need to mobilise as quickly and as effectively. And I particularly want to focus my contribution around the debates and arguments inside the trade union movement. But before I do so, because I might not have the opportunity, can I send my solidarity to Jose, who's going to be speaking next, I believe, from Italy, who I understand there'll be some sort of strikes across Italy on Saturday. They've been an absolute inspiration, and I'd like to send a total solidarity from UCU to that union, and I hope we can. We're not quite there yet, unfortunately, to creating that kind of activity, but I hope what we can do is start to get moved towards that kind of necessary action, the power that we could unleash as trade unions to defend and to carry through an argument, as Tom just said, about why we need welfare and not warfare. It was 9 months ago that the TUC met and UCU, seconded by the RMT, put a emergency motion to the Congress, which was last September, which argued for to stop the escalation of war within the Middle East. It called upon the TUC to back the workplace days of action. There have been 9 so far, there have been 8 so far, which CND, Stop the War, and other organisations have backed. That motion was carried unanimously. On the 9th, on the 2nd of July, there will be the 9th day of action, workplace day of action. That's sort of Tuesday, and that has got to be the biggest one we have done yet. We've involved thousands of trade unionists in those days of action. We have involved hundreds of different trade unions and workplaces and so on. But we've got a challenge now tonight that we're setting out to say that on the Tuesday, the July the 2nd, that we want to see that workplace day of action. It can be walkouts, it can be selfies in your workplace if you haven't got that level of organization, lunchtime protests, whatever you think is appropriate in your workplace to do something to demand the end to genocide and to ensure that there is no that we stop the war in Iran for all the reasons that have been outlined and so eloquently put thus far. And I want to, let me just focus a little bit now at what kinds of arguments perhaps we will need to conduct, because I think clearly Starmer's war drive, as Jeremy and others have pointed out, is very much increasing. There's an article, by Paul Mason, once left-wing journalist, now sycophant for Starmer and his government, and it's an attack on a conference which others in this call were a part of. We Demand Change conference, and he really launched into attacks. He didn't like our arguments about welfare and warfare, and he put an argument very strongly that we need more arms spending so that we can create a situation where we can then create wealth tax on those arms industries, and that can then be funneled back into the economy. He went further. He's argued that and re-referenced the historical of the 1950s, where there essentially was a permanent arms economy brought about, where we had 20 years of growing increased living standards, but spending a lot more on weapons of mass destruction. He said, well, look, this is the sort of thing we've done it before, we could do it again. Now, take aside there's no sort of understanding that the real need here is for international cooperation and collectivism and not more weapons of mass destruction. It seems to take that side of the point. The idea that you could repeat what took place in the 1950s today with an economy which clearly is far, far weaker, far, far more in crisis, is clearly laughable, even if it's desirable, which it isn't. It's quite clear that even the jobs that will apparently be created by, which is the argument being put by Starmer, will not create mass jobs at all. It's a complete, smoke and mirrors argument, and one which we inside the trade union need to take on. There clearly are people inside which every year for the last number of years we've tried to take it on. Last year's TUC conference, we passed very important motions on Israel and one I've mentioned about stop escalation. But there's a real debate led by the GMB and Unite leaderships to try and ensure that they praise and want to push more arms spending because they have members in those industries. I mean, Shan Graham is an example of this, a trade union leader who's quite contradictory. On the one hand, he's very, very vehemently against the attack really against Starmer and austerity, and makes some fantastic speech about it, but at the same time is very in support of more money being poured into the arms industry and so on. Despite that, I'll clearly mean many of our members in the health industry who work in health at the hospitals and so on will actually face far more attack, because the money will come from their pay packets, it will come from their jobs, it will come from the local government workers and education and so on and so forth to pay for those weapons of mass destruction. And I think the argument we've been trying to carry inside the Stop the War movement and Stop the War movement, inside the labour and trade union movement more generally, is this. Because this was thrown at us time again, that those of us who campaign for peace, those of us who campaign for less spending on arms, are diverting the argument from the economic arguments that workers face over conditions, austerity, and so on. And we've argued nothing be further from the truth. In fact, those who try to straddle the horse on the one hand saying we need more arms spending, and then at the same time we're against cuts in welfare actually weaken the ability for our working class in this country to defend their conditions of service, their pay and their wages. Why? Because the workforce that is divided divided by racism, by transphobia, whatever the divisions are, sexism and so on, and the question of war, if they believe that we have a national interest to defend our Union Jack against the threat of military attacks from Russia or wherever it might be, then clearly we will be much more in a situation, or a much weaker situation, to be able to defend our conditions of service. So the battle, if you like, for all the pay and conditions and a battle for peace aren't separate things. They go hand in hand together. And those trade unions and those workplaces, I know from my own experience, who've managed to not only fight over the conditions of service, but ones who are most likely to be able to defend their members on these questions are also the ones that have been at the forefront at defending and fighting for peace and justice and against genocide and for peace in the Middle East and so on. So that motion that was passed 9 months ago, now the TUC have actually supported the last days of action. Now we need to act that motion much more effectively than we have done in the past. And that's why I say we are calling for the demonstration, so the protest outside the workplaces on the day. We've also asked for, on the demonstration on Saturday, that we have a trade union block. We're asking people to bring as many trade union banners as possible to that demonstration. I generally believe that, you know, we've spoken a lot here about, Tom mentioned it, that sometimes we feel that, are we making a difference? And a lot of my people in my workplace said they've been on every single protest, every single workplace. Is it making a difference? And somebody turned around in one of our meetings and said, well, think about it this way. Just imagine if we hadn't protested. Just imagine there wasn't millions on the streets. Just imagine we hadn't had thousands of people in our workplaces organising for stopping genocide and so on. What would it be like? What would it be like for those inside Gaza at this moment at the time and think that nobody supports them? So I think that's a powerful argument. I think we are making a difference. It's quite clear at the top of the society, there are clearly much more, the weight of pressure to stop genocide has clearly altered very, very drastically. So solidarity to everybody, and I hope everybody, I see you on the demonstrations, and hopefully everybody can do what they can for the 2nd of July.
Thank you, Sean. And the voice of trade unionists and trade union activists is incredibly important in everything that we do. And in fact, in Britain, on a number of occasions in the past, trade unionists have taken decisive action. They've passed resolutions, yes. They've agreed to certain positions, yes. They've mobilised for demonstrations, yes. But there have been a number of high points where British trade unionists, industrial workers and others have taken decisive strike action and so-called illegal action in opposition to war. They did it over nuclear testing. There was a huge wave of protest and action around the time of the Iraq war. And we need to gear ourselves up to doing similar or making similar things like that happen again. But there are parts of the world not so far away where workers are already taking matters into their own hands when they're faced with huge international issues, when they're faced with the prospect of supplying arms to genocidal states and so on and so forth. And so we are honoured really to have Jose Nevoy, a trade unionist and dock worker who works in the docks at Genoa, who earlier this month refused to handle arms bound for Israel. And it's that sort of action, that level of activity, that level of commitment to humanity as a whole that we need to generalize and see replicated across the board. Jose will speak through a translator, Fiorella, but we're very honored to have you here, and thank you very much, Jose.
Ciao a tutte e a tutti, grazie a voi dell'invito ed è sempre un piacere partecipare a questo genere di iniziative che sono molto importanti.
Thank you, everyone. It's always a pleasure to be part of this sort of initiatives that are very important this time in historical times, and thank you for the invite.
Sono un dirigente sindacale dell'Unione Sindacale di Base, faccio parte del collettivo autonomo lavoratori portuali che è nato nel 2011 proprio per cercare di intervenire anche politicamente all'interno dei luoghi di lavoro.
I am a union leader with the USB and a member of the Autonomous Collective of Dock Workers in Genova, which was founded in 2011 to bring these political issues also in the place of work.
Siamo conosciuti per organizzare, diciamo, blocchi contro l'invio di materiale bellico dal porto di Genova con queste navi che possiamo definire navi della morte dal 2019.
We have organized blockades of military cargo in the port of Genova with what we call ships of death since 2019.
Negli ultimi, diciamo, 18 mesi abbiamo cercato di costruire un coordinamento internazionale, questo grazie all'FSM, in inglese credo che sia WFTU, che è l'organizzazione internazionale che ci rappresenta come USB, come l'Unione Sindacale di Base.
Over the past year and a half, we've built a strong network of international cooperation, particularly through the FSM, which is a federation that brings together dock workers, port workers, unions in various countries.
Costruendo appunto un coordinamento internazionale composto da paesi come la Francia, la Grecia, il Marocco, il Cipro, la Turchia, la Svezia e ovviamente noi italiani.
We have been able to build an international coordination between countries such as France, Greece, Morocco, Cyprus, Turkey, Sweden, and obviously Italy.
Abbiamo anche altri contatti, diciamo, di dialogo con altri porti in Sudafrica, in Venezuela e negli Stati Uniti d'America, oltre ad altre aree, diciamo, fuori dai confini del Mediterraneo.
We have also established dialogues with other port workers in South Africa, in the US, Venezuela, and beyond the Mediterranean area.
La nostra lotta ovviamente nasce da quelle che sono le rivendicazioni sindacali per anche poi trasformarsi in rivendicazioni più politiche, come appunto il blocco delle armi.
So our fight is rooted in labor struggles, but of course it's deeply political, and this is why we're doing the blockade of the cargoes and the military cargoes in particular.
Questo perché subiamo degli attacchi al mondo del lavoro fatti appunto a contratti sempre più precari, a stipendi sempre più bassi e contemporaneamente diciamo che mentre esportiamo questi armamenti ci ritornano sui posti di lavoro o nella vita quotidiana sotto forma di inflazione, aumento del costo della vita e impoverimento generale, perché ovviamente siamo dei lavoratori ma anche dei cittadini.
As workers, we face increasingly precarious and poorly paid contracts, but while weapons leave our ports, war comes back at us in our homes in the form of inflation, rising living costs and social impoverishment.
Quindi per noi appunto fermare il traffico di armi è un atto politico, un gesto di solidarietà internazionale anche.
So for us, stopping the arms trade is not only a labor act, it's an act of solidarity and international resistance.
Negli ultimi mesi ovviamente ci siamo concentrati di più verso quelle che sono le armi destinate a Israele e proprio la settimana scorsa è partita questa battaglia che ha preso una svolta molto importante anche rispetto a quello che è il coordinamento internazionale di cui dicevo prima, appunto con la solidarietà che si è attivata tra i francesi del porto di Fos-sur-Mer e appunto noi di Genova.
In recent months, we've been especially focused on blocking arms shipments to Israel. Just last week, this fight took a powerful turn through solidarity between dock workers in Marseille and Geneva, highlighting the international coordination and solidarity I was talking earlier. The Marseille dock workers of Fos-sur-Mer refused to load a container belonging. Sorry, you continue.
Infatti, appunto, i lavoratori portuali di Fos-sur-Mer in Marsiglia si sono rifiutati di caricare questi 3 container della compagnia ZIM, che è una compagnia di bandiera israeliana, appunto, proprio perché c'era il sospetto che fossero carichi di armamenti e poi di fatto erano pieni di armamenti diretti a Israele.
So our colleagues, dock workers in Marseille at the port of Os-Dumer refused to load a container belonging to Zim, an Israeli shipping line, which was believed to be carrying weapons, which indeed they did have weapons on those cargoes.
Ovviamente
Yeah, they had weapons and arms.
E hanno avvisato anche a noi da Genova, i portuali appunto francesi, perché appunto dopo Marsiglia faceva tratta su Genova. Quando abbiamo ricevuto la comunicazione, ci siamo subito attivati per creare appunto un blocco anche noi a Genova.
So they alerted us in Genova and asked us to monitor the container and ensure it remained empty. And so we organized ourselves to make sure that this was not going to happen, fearing it could be reloaded with arms via land transport before reaching our port.
Così appunto ci siamo organizzati, preparati per bloccare sia la nave nel caso i francesi non fossero riusciti a bloccare i container, sia l'accesso al porto, proprio perché avevamo anche paura che potessero spedirli su Genova via camion e poi imbarcarli da Genova.
So we got organized and we prepared to either block the ship directly on the port of Genova or to block truck access on the port, because we were fearing that the arms could arrive to Genova via land through buses, through other means.
Alla fine di fatto i container non sono mai arrivati a Genova, proprio né via terra né via mare, perché appunto i portuali marsigliesi sono riusciti a isolarli lì. Comunque noi abbiamo mantenuto la mobilitazione con appunto la presenza nostra ai varchi e anche all'interno del porto.
So the weapons, the armaments didn't manage to get to the port. Our colleagues in Marseille were successful at stopping them, but we kept the mobilization and we kept our presence on the ground to make sure that we were making our presence seen and our voice heard.
Appunto, la giornata è stata molto partecipata ed ha funzionato anche grazie al collegamento, diciamo, che in questi anni abbiamo mantenuto anche con gli studenti, proprio perché crediamo che anche le università siano complici di quelle che sono il riarmo che stiamo vivendo ormai da troppo tempo in Europa, con due organizzazioni nello specifico. Una è Cambiare Rotta, che come dire, organizza gli studenti universitari, e l'altra è OSA, che organizza gli studenti delle superiori.
So it was a very strong mobilization that came together within just a few hours. Of course, our group, the dock workers, was the core of that mobilization, but it was joined by student movements because we believe that also universities are part of fueling war, and also with high school movements such as OSA. And this was possible through consistent dialogue and coordination, bringing together workers and youth in a common struggle and highlighting the complicity of these different sectors in warmongering.
E per chiudere aggiungo che domani saremo di nuovo in sciopero generale, dove partiremo da uno dei varchi del porto di Genova per andare poi in corteo a contestare appunto la compagnia Zim situata qua a Genova, e il 21 saremo a Roma a una grande manifestazione organizzata appunto per chiedere lo stop al genocidio che sta subendo il popolo palestinese, contro il riarmo europeo e contro la NATO. Grazie a tutte e a tutti.
So to conclude, I would like to say that tomorrow we will have a general strike, which will also see a demo moving towards the establishment or the buildings of Zim. And also on the 21st of June, we will be in Rome for a national demonstration that demands the stop of the genocide that is happening. Thank you very much for the invite.
Thank you massively, Jose, and thank you, Fiorella, for that contribution. Incredibly inspiring, but also incredibly important lessons to draw for us all. So time is running short. There have been a large number of questions put in the chat. So I'm proposing that I summarize some of those and then invite our speakers to come back in the order that they spoke to close the meeting. And there was one big theme throughout a lot of the questions and answers, and that is exactly what can we do? Yes, we can protest. Yes, we can go on demonstrations, but what can we as individuals and in our communities do to rebuild and reinvigorate the anti-war movement across the country? So that's point number one. There was a question around parliamentary process, which is an important thing in the domestic sense in this country. But what process would Keir Starmer have to go through if he did decide to commit the UK to taking part in Israel's war against Iran? A second question was, is it reasonable, and this is, in my view, an important point to raise, is it reasonable for Iran to agree to talks with a country that's threatening to bomb it? Where does military action, in other words, leave diplomacy? And last question really from Shaz, which is vital for me. How can we convince our friends to join the anti-war movement? So let's go back to our speakers. Jeremy's had to leave us, so I'm going to ask Mariam to come back in just for a couple of minutes on those points, please, Mariam.
I will answer the question on what British people can do to support Iranians, Palestinians, or those who have been oppressed by Israel. And first and foremost, supporting demonstrations is vital. Movements like CND Stop the War, PSC have kept the call for peace and justice alive when others have stayed silent. Protesting publicly shows that people care and that we're watching, and we won't accept war being waged in our name. So yes, show up, speak out, and stand in solidarity. Visible resistance matters, but you must go further. Challenge misinformation whenever you see it, online, in conversation, in the press. Share trusted sources, especially from independent journalists and voices directly affected by this conflict. Push back on spin against lazy justifications for war. Next, I would say contact your MP directly and repeatedly. Don't just sign a petition. Write, call, book a meeting, demand that they speak in Parliament, demand that they call for an immediate ceasefire and diplomatic resolution. Tell them clearly, if you support war crimes, if you stay silent, I will not vote for you. That is your democratic right, and it carries weight. So yes, demonstrations do matter deeply, but they're just the beginning. What we do in between protests, how we speak, how we share our thoughts, how we organise, that's where long-term power lies.
Thank you, Mariam. Absolutely, demonstrations are of vital importance, and let's get as many people as possible to London this Saturday. I'm going to call in Paul Rogers next to respond. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks very much. I think all I do is follow on directly from Mariam and say this is one of those rare occasions where you should go and try and speak to your MP, particularly if that MP is Labour. This is one occasion when I think it might have an impact. If you're well enough informed and competent to say to them that they've got to recognise what's happening, that Labour will not deserve to get anybody's vote in the next election if they don't change their policies on this of all policies. And I think, you know, if you get to see your MP in the next couple of weeks and make a point of doing it and nagging them, I think this is one of the rare occasions where it could have an impact.
Thank you, Paul. If you're a constituent of Islington North, then you already know what your Member of Parliament thinks. Sean, over to you next.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, just to reinforce, I do think that taking the argument into the into your workplaces, into union branches, deepening it and broadening it, all the arguments that have been rehearsed tonight are really important. As Mariam said, pushing back on the weak arguments that the government are putting forward. I'd just like to say as well, which will help this perhaps, and I forgot to mention it, UCU passed a motion at our conference to go to TUC again this year, calling for a cut in arms spending. We'll be creating a petition around that, so branches can use that to create that debate and so on. Hopefully, we can take that argument to the heart of the TUC to make sure we can win this argument about war is not good for any work in this country. So look out for that as well. But yeah, deepen the movement inside the workplaces and invite anti-war activists to speak at your branch meetings.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sean. Lindsay.
Yeah, I guess we're all going to be saying very similar things, but I would just say about the demonstrations, because I think people see the demonstrations as a kind of one-off and then people go home, and obviously that's true in terms of what they're like. But I see them very much as a means of galvanizing people locally to do more things. So if you go there as a kind of member of the community, or if you're from a mosque, or if you're from a trade union, you then take the arguments back. Maybe you take badges and leaflets and things back. Maybe you organize a local event, and that has a kind of snowballing effect. And I think we've got to try and really see the demonstrations as a much more sort of fluid thing, not just, on one day we all go together. That's important. But as everybody has said, and as Jose has said about, because in Italy, there's been some very big demonstrations lately, that demonstration on Saturday will have a huge impact. Now then, can it link up to industrial action? Can it link up to trade union action is the crucial question. So just to really agree with people, and just one final point, because Paul said about the Labour MPs being, and I don't want to talk about the process that Starmer has to go through in terms of Parliament, A, because I'm not an expert on it, and B, because I mean, really, you'd think there would be some discussion in Parliament over this major threat of World War III. But what I do think is, I think Starmer's under a great deal of pressure in this country over these questions. That on the surface, people look like they support him, but if you look at the opinion polls, they're not good for him over these questions. If you look at the United States, majority don't want Trump to attack Iran. So, we do need to think about how we use our direct action and our politics to actually put pressure on these MPs. So, and the Trade Union Day of Action is very important. So thanks very much, everybody. It's been a great evening and discussion. Thanks,
Lindsay. Sophie.
Thanks. I mean, I think to reiterate the point about the fact that we are the majority, if you, as Lindsay said, if you look at the polling, like, people overwhelmingly do not support the priorities of increasing military spending rather than giving people, decent benefits so they can have, live in dignity. That's first thing. Also, Britain's special relationship with the US, this military and nuclear subordination to the US is having a big impact. People are very, very against Donald Trump. They totally recognize how dangerous he is, and they see him dragging us into, more and more kind of wars, that are going to kind of, make the world far more dangerous. So we're seeing that, there's a greater increase in the number of people who oppose US nuclear weapons being based in Britain, for instance. So, we really have the answers, because, we are facing such serious crises, interlinked crises that are really exposing the fact that, the world as it is organized is not working for us. It's not working for any of us. And so more and more people are prepared to challenge it, and more people are aware of how serious the consequences are. We definitely know that people are very, aware of how serious the nuclear threat is, and they want to do something about it. So I suppose take heart from that. We are in the majority, we're in the global majority, let's learn from Iraq. As Paul said, those protests did have a massive political impact, and people will have not forgotten the horrific impact of that war and further ones. So, I would just agree that every action that people takes does have a real impact. Let's just encourage people to keep protesting and getting involved, working in their communities and what have you. All of it really makes a difference. And also, we are part of a hugely effective movement. As I say, the movement against the Iraq war, did have a massive political impact. But also, Greenham Common, non-violent direct action, these campaigns did get rid of nuclear weapons, in Britain. So we can do it again. So let's kind of remember that we're part of this very rich tradition. And there is no other alternative, is there? We've just got to do this. Thanks.
Thank you, Sophie. But the bottom line is that Starmer is not going to take the question of war or peace against Iran to Parliament unless he comes under an enormous amount of pressure, both from his MPs on his benches, but also from the population at large. And the best way, the most effective way for us to manifest that pressure is to go on the demonstrations, but also to organise wherever we are. We do, I'm afraid, need to consider very seriously rebuilding and reinvigorating the anti-war and peace movements wherever we are. On the streets of London, yes, but in your communities and in your workplaces also. So this discussion is going to have to continue, and one of the key places that will continue is in your locality. So get organising, join Stop the War, join the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, get involved and get active and bring others along with you. I'm going to ask Jose to come back and just to give some concluding remarks if possible. Unfortunately, we will have to see each other again, I think, in arenas like this. But over to Jose to close the meeting, please. Who's there? Jose and Fiorella?
Here we are.
Okay, thank you.
Ok, scusate, ho fatto un po' di casini con le chat. E come potermi supportare, come poter supportare questa lotta che stiamo portando attraverso i porti, appunto è cercare di metterci in connessione con altri portuali del vostro stato o con quelli che magari conoscete anche al di fuori, diciamo, dei confini della vostra nazione, e questo già è un ottimo, diciamo, punto di partenza, no? Se vogliamo anche di unire un po' tutta la questione tutti assieme.
So one way to that people can support us in the work that we are doing is to connect us with other dock workers in the UK, with other unions of dock workers, both in the UK as well as other places internationally, to build and strengthen the international coordination of dock workers to stop armed trades.
E l'altra, diciamo, l'altra che penso che sia molto utile è la mediaticità, proprio perché quello che abbiamo notato con l'ultimo blocco, mentre diciamo i canali più attenti e con migliaia di utenti che guardano sui social network piuttosto che nei canali non convenzionali della comunicazione, lo sciopero e il coordinamento è apparso e c'è stata una comunicazione, mentre invece in quelli che sono, diciamo, i mainstream comuni, quindi televisioni, giornali, se vogliamo ormai di Stato, che scrivono comunque tutti la stessa cosa, lì la notizia non è trapelata. Quindi il sostegno mediatico ai lavoratori, a noi, anche ai vostri, nel senso non sono io a darvi dei consigli, è una diciamo delle funzioni molto importanti in questo momento.
So the second way of supporting our work is through support through media. So like support us to be present and share our work through social media, which in our last action has proved incredibly important. Our action has been streamed in on so many different alternative medias that rather than like those national medias where, you know, on the national medias, our action was barely showed or discussed. So that sort of support to kind of help us to bring our work, get our work better known is incredibly helpful for our movement.
E la terza e ultima direi cosa è il sostegno incondizionato ai lavoratori, qualunque essi siano, perché ripeto un po' quello che ci sta un po' preoccupando, no? Non in maniera negativa, però ci preoccupa, è che quando c'è un'attenzione appunto mediatica o di, come posso dire, di scena, no? Figa, ora dico, non so come dire, bella, allora c'è un appoggio quasi incondizionato da tutte le aree politiche, quando invece si tratta ad esempio dei rider che portano, come dire, la pizza a casa, sulle loro battaglie c'è una disattenzione rispetto alla condizione loro di lavoro. Quindi Questo è quello che stiamo un po' cercando di fare in Italia, perché ci stiamo rendendo conto di questo, ecco.
And thirdly and finally, the way to support us, but all workers, is to support all workers and all trade unions. And in particular, we have seen that our action was seen as very positive, was well received by various political groups, but we want to avoid that this type of actions shadow the work that other more vulnerable groups and workers are conducting. For example, the riders here in Italy, where their work is not recognized. So we want to create those connections between different areas of trade union actions and create that large solidarity across all work sectors.
Thank you massively,
Gracias.
Jose and Fiorella. Look, we know that solidarity is vital, and we also know that solidarity can and it will change the world. And our actions together, our organising, will not just put a stop to wars, but also to the exploitation and oppression that Jose and others have addressed here this evening. One final reminder: if you're not already members of CND and Stop the War, join. If you're not already active, please get active. We have a huge amount of work to do and time is short. Thank you very much to all of our speakers. Thank you very much to everybody who joined us this evening. Solidarity forever.
Cheers. Bye-bye.